Cinema St. Louis's The Lens is now the takeup.com, a place to gather after the film is over. I'm your host, Joshua Ray, and fear not, all your favorite episodes of The Lens featuring all your favorite guests are still here in your feed, just a little refocused. Stay subscribed to us here for future episodes, and you can follow along for new ones and more at the Takeup STL. It's the take-up.com. Thanks, Brian. And thank you for joining us. Like I said, if you want to come closer, you're welcome to. I don't think we mind having people in our faces. We're always in theirs. Well, really the idea behind this is to talk more generally about film criticism, but also the place that we're in the Midwest. I think we have advantages and disadvantages, but we can go as broad as we want in this, and I hope we do too. Talk about the industry at large in the past and maybe into the future. But really where I wanted to start is introducing everyone, our panelists here. We'll start to my left and go down. This is Cliff Freilich, retired executive director. I don't need this for you, of Cinema St. Louis, the owners of the lovely High Point and our hosts for the day. And Cliff, I mean, you've done everything in journalism, Riverfront Times, film critic, then managing editor, St. Louis Magazine. I mean, everything that you've ever read in print in St. Louis, I think Cliff Freilich has touched at some point. And you continue to freelance. We've got a piece at the Take-Up about Howard Hawks' aviation films. You can read an abbreviated version of the Common Reader if you must. But yes, and freelancing for the Riverfront Times as well. Thank you, Cliff, for being here. And then we have Elliot Collins of the Movie Files YouTube channel, also film critic for KMOV, making appearances on Great Day St. Louis. And Elliot has something like 10,000 followers on your channel? Sure, he says. Very humble man. And then we've got Eileen Giselle. Eileen is a poet, culture critic, regular contributions here to Riverfront Times, but also Hyperallergic, Reverse Shot, Movie Notebook, Los Angeles Review of Books, Salon, Vice, other outlets. Served as film critic for Hopkins Review since 2021, and a very recent, as of not announced yet, Rabkin Foundation Award for Arts Journalism. One of how many? Eight awarded each year. An incredible honor. And thank you for being here. Last but not least is Diane Carson. Hi, Diane. Professor Emerita at St. Louis Community College. She contributes weekly film reviews, KDHX, and also the Alliance of Women Film Journalists. Filmmaker. We're going to be talking about a lot of the cross-disciplinary functions that we all have as film critics and film critics working today. But really want to start at the beginning of everything, to be very cute about it. I want to start with how you began as a film critic. I think that's what people are really interested in how do you break into it, but also maybe where did your film love start? I was probably 15 or so when Mulholland Drive came out, David Lynch's 2001 film, and got very obsessed with it. So much that it led me to reading film critics so that I could understand it. Do I understand it today? Probably not as well as others. But I remember Slant Magazine, Ed Gonzalez's review. I remember Roger Ebert's review. I remember reading these things and saying, I think I like this. I think I like this idea. I started my own website. The very first thing I ever wrote was a review of Fellini's Nights of Cabiria. I'm sure you can find it somewhere in the Wayback Machine. And if you do, don't let me know that you have. My first real published piece was, Cliff was my professor at Webster University. And, halfway through the semester, he says, do you like this stuff? So I ended up writing at a relaunch of Cinema St. Louis's film blog, The Lens, writing a review of Chloe Zhao's The Writer. And when Andrew Wyatt, who I am with now at takeup.com, took his digital red pen to it, I thought my life was over. But since then, have written quite a bit, but that's slowed down. I'm a film critic for KMOV, have a podcast. First thing I reviewed at KMOV was Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And the anchor asked me, what is the message of this film? So I started writing the questions after that. Cliff, what about you? How'd you start?
Well, I became interested in film in high school primarily, and then started seeing lots of, I drug friends to films that they probably were not particularly interested in, like The Ruling Class and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And I continued to do that through college, and ended up at that point seeing between 200 and 300 films a year, seeing lots of double bills, the heyday of repertory cinema. And I wrote my first review in 1976, All the President's Men. I did it for a class. Wow. Yes, when it was released. I did it for a class, and the professor said, really like this, like to publish it. He was the advisor for the University News at St. Louis University, which is where I went to undergrad. So it ended up getting published. That was my first published work, and then I sort of launched in that direction. Journalism, I was going to be a lawyer. I decided I would be a journalist instead. And I went to Mizzou, where I wrote my thesis on the history of film comment magazine. Eventually, about half of that thesis was published in Film Comment. Still available online if you want to look it up. And I got my first paid gig, not very much pay, with the Riverfront Times in 1983. I'm very old. And that was Betrayal. So I started with Pinter. Since that point, I've obviously done, as you pointed out, a lot of different editorial gigs. Managing editor of St. Louis Magazine, executive editor of RFC, arts editor at St. Louis Magazine, but I eventually ended up at Cinema St. Louis as the executive director and did programming primarily, but I did continue to write throughout that entire period, contributing occasionally to all those publications and a few others.
Very good. Ellie?
All right, the origin story. Well, first off, I just feel so honored to be here amongst this great panel, because I would say I'm the rookie of the film criticism. I started officially probably about a year ago, as far as putting my thoughts out there in a more critical point of view. But my film criticism probably started back kind of similar to Josh when I was in high school, and I'm a big fan of horror, and always have been. But for some reason, James Wan's masterpiece of Saw was like a film that I don't know what it was about that movie that just made me want to just like dive into the making of the movie, the meaning of certain aspects. Me and my friend would watch that and honestly the series and just pick out so many different things that we can just talk about for hours. So from that, it stemmed from taking classes of film study in high school, went to College of DePage to get my degree in film and video, and here we are. In 2017, I launched my YouTube channel as more as a hobby, and as time went by, reached out to different screening events to attend screenings, and you meet people there, you start conversations, and people invite you to critic groups, and you get on the news, and here you are on a panel with great film critics. So yeah, that's the story, and hopefully many more years of story to add to that. So.
Absolutely. Eileen?
So I didn't ever anticipate that I would be a film critic in any capacity. I was pre-med and undergraduate and thought I was going to be a neonatologist someday. And when I decided to shift from that to focusing on writing, I went from undergrad to graduate school at the University of Rochester, immediately, which in retrospect was a mistake, and the program was not a good fit for me, and I ended up dropping out of the program with a master's degree. But when I was at the University of Rochester, I lived about 3 blocks away from the George Eastman House. And that was a happy accident because I didn't even know, prior to applying to the University of Rochester, I didn't even really know what the George Eastman House or the George Eastman Archive was. I had huge illusions in terms of cinematic history, how films are made, all of it. I'm not from a family of cinephiles. We didn't go see great movies regularly. We saw mainstream movies like, I don't know, Baby. Does anyone remember Baby, about the dinosaur from the mid-'80s?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so that was the first movie I can remember seeing in the theater. It was Baby, about a dinosaur. So, maybe E.T. was around there as well. So I really feel like at that time, film became kind of a companion. Because I was very alone in graduate school, I didn't have much of a social life at all. And so I would go to the George Eastman House and see as many films as possible. And because I was a student, it was practically free to go. So I saw so many older films on the big screen on film, because this was prior to all of the cameras being switched out for digital. Like I was seeing everything on film, and I just kind of took it for granted. After a year and a half, I was constantly watching films. There's another theater in Rochester called the Little Theater that would get the films that opened in New York maybe a week later. So the Little Theater showed a lot of international films and a lot of independent films that were not widely distributed, especially outside the coasts, and also showed them sooner than they would arrive at other places. So I was just kind of immersed in it, and film became a kind of companion. And then after I came to St. Louis to get my MFA in poetry, I published nothing but poetry for probably about 8 years. And then in my mid-30s, I had an idea for a culture, like a piece of culture criticism that was not fundamentally film-related, but it was more a pattern I was seeing in pop culture and the way that women represent themselves in pop culture. And then in 2015, when I was in New York for that summer, I saw the train wreck posters all over the place with Amy Schumer. And I thought, this movie, which I hadn't even seen yet, I thought maybe this movie will connect to my larger theory. And if it does, I can use this movie as an excuse to try to actually publish this essay, okay? And so I did everything I could, pulled every string I had, contacted everyone I knew, which is not very many people. And I was very lucky and was able to get that essay published in Salon. When it was published in Salon, it was, to my great fortune, it went viral. It was one of the best, and that hasn't happened to me since in the same way. I've published hundreds of things, and that's never happened again. But it was thrilling to have an audience and to have people engaged in discourse. So after I wrote that piece, it wasn't even a film piece, but I did mention Trainwreck for a couple paragraphs. From there, I felt like, okay, I have to keep going. I have this momentum. I have to keep doing this. I'm not going to miss this opportunity. So for Salon, for about 2 years, I wrote film essays frequently. And I was usually seeing these films on my own dime, going to the cinema, and then writing about them as quickly as possible. So that was really the beginning, was that period of time in 2015 to 2016. And since then, I've branched off and written for a lot of different publications, both primarily thought pieces, more thesis-driven pieces, but also, as with RFT most recently with the Barbie movie, sometimes writing a short-form review can be easy and fun. So
easy and fun, but also it can be very difficult sometimes too.
It can. I find short-form reviews, I find them so much easier. I think it's just because I'm such a perfectionist and there's fewer words there.
I understand.
So I just feel like there's less of an opportunity to screw up. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Diane, how about you?
I would say that, as you see, all of us started differently, and you all are so lucky to be here today when people know what film criticism and film reviewing is, because when I grew up, I didn't even know there was such a thing. But I go way back, and when I think back on it now, I realize that the movies I saw in the 50s, 1950s, that's how far back I go, I remember them. And I should have known then that this was something I should have pursued, but there wasn't any such thing. And I remember The Tingler and North to Alaska and The Blob. And I can see those films to this day. So if you're like that, follow your passion. But there wasn't any such thing. So I was at KU getting a degree in English, which is where at that point almost all of the film people came from. And a sweet mate of mine who was in chemistry always wanted to escape to go out to a movie. And I was like, oh yeah, sure, I'm for that. Instead of writing another paper on James Joyce, why not? And so we would go to, and for good fortune, KU had one of the best film series. Now again, this was 1970. And I remember the films I saw then, but then I saw films like Rashomon and Citizen Kane and Ingmar Bergman, Shane, and it was like, oh my gosh, what can film be? Because I just only knew Hollywood stuff until then. And started teaching English at St. Louis Community College, Merrimack, and decided I have to learn more about this. But I thought it was just a passing fancy. I never thought that I would end up so immersed in film. So I started the film program there in '72 and became more obsessed with it, as probably we all have, and decided I need to get a sabbatical and go back to film school, which is what I did, switched departments and never looked back. And then in terms of the reviewing, I was asked if I would, KDHX was just starting then. And I was asked if, since I was teaching film, if I would be interested in doing some film reviews for them. And I said, sure, and I knew nothing about doing reviews for radio. But that is where I think all of you should come in, which is jump off the cliff. Just if you have an opportunity, and this was all volunteer, get involved in it, show up. And also the other aspect of my background that I wanted to connect with all of you is learn about film. Most of you, at least those of you I know, already are doing that. But be a professional, study film, take film courses, which when I came back here with my English degree and wanted to learn more about film, I thought I'm going to take every film class that exists in St. Louis, 5. That was it. I ended up with a media communication degree because there was no film degree in St. Louis. And that was when I then decided, well, I do have to go back to film school and get just a film degree, which I did in production and in theory and criticism. So I was asked, after I'd started teaching just film, if I wanted to volunteer, because as you probably know, except for the people who run the station, it's all volunteer. And I said, sure. I love this, and I loved teaching. I wanted to share what I knew and get more people enthused about really good films. I'm not much of a Hollywood person at all, and so I wanted to be able to promote independent films, art films, etc. And then after I was reviewing for KDHX, I met Cliff at Webster and said, I'd be happy to do some things for RFT also, and he gave me a go. And so I wrote for years for RFT as well. And I still do reviews for KDHX. And then, again, just volunteer, get your work out there, help other people out. And the Alliance of Women Film Journalists came to me and asked me if I would be interested in joining and publishing my reviews there as well. So it's really a matter of be a professional, work hard, have a great work ethic, and help other people out, talk to people, network, and you'll find a path.
It's excellent advice. It's what I took too long to learn is just do the work. I was reading a lot of film criticism. I was sort of obsessed with film from a young age and wanted to do something with film, but didn't start my degree until very late. And I do have a degree in film studies from Webster, but it was, professors like Cliff and other people who would see my work, and they imbued me with confidence. And so eventually I got confident in my work myself and my talent, and then sort of reached out and started volunteering with Cinema St. Louis, doing some help with Chris Clark with Q-Fest, and getting involved in finding the scene here in St. Louis, because when I first moved here, I didn't see one. And I didn't see one because it's not always that visible, but now being in it, I know that it is actually larger than one might think. And so with that, I'm wondering if Cliff or Diane, you can talk about the growth or not of the film scene in St. Louis, and specifically film criticism in St. Louis.
Certainly things have changed considerably from the time when I started back in 1983. Film criticism largely consisted of the Post-Dispatch, Joe Pollock, who did everything. He was the film critic, the theater critic, the wine critic, the restaurant critic. Joe literally did everything that was related to criticism except for music at the Post-Dispatch. And then he was supplemented by Harper Barnes. I love Joe as a person, but I was never especially fond of his film criticism. His basic attitude was, I can write better than anyone who can write faster, and faster than anyone who can write better. Well, okay. If that's the sort of approach that you're going to take to your writing, that's fine. But Harper was actually a far more thoughtful and interesting critic. Prior to Joe, there was actually a more thoughtful film critic at the Post. I didn't have a lot of experience with him as a youngster, but Miles Standish was another guy who wrote some interesting pieces for the Post. But that was it. And then at the RFT at the time I came on board, Robert Hunt, who later became a colleague after a little bit of upset, I was brought on, and Robert was not told that I was being brought on as a second film critic. And he ended up writing a review that I had already been assigned, and he left in a huff, went to St. Louis Weekly. Robert's a terrific film critic, and then subsequently has written for the RFT and many, many, many other publications over the years, and I eventually was able to recruit him back after I was there. So that's where things sort of started. There wasn't much else going on from a film critical point of view. The St. Louis Review also had some film criticism. That's the St. Louis Catholic publication. They actually had a guy by the name of George Weed. He was a brother. I can't remember what order. But anyway, he actually wrote some pretty fascinating criticism. So there were a few, but not much. Not much that was to speak of. So I, at the RFT, started accumulating people. I couldn't do it all myself. I didn't want to. And so I brought Susan Waugh on initially, Diane, Robert came back, and then I started sort of fanning out and recruited probably by the time everything ended, I probably had as many as a dozen people who would write film criticism on an occasional basis with the gang of four, as Robert used to refer to as being the core. And at that point, I think things really did begin to solidify from a film critical point of view. There were more people. But there's still, at that early stage, I left to go to the festival in 2001. That was still sort of the beginnings of the web. I mean, things obviously had begun to accumulate, but people weren't so inclined to just publish their own reviews, create their own websites, do blogs, things of that nature. That's really accelerated, and that, I think, has opened up a world of possibility. You don't earn any money necessarily doing it, but by the same token, you have this multiplicity of voices that are now available that were otherwise shut out because the gatekeepers. There were only so many column inches available, and so you weren't going to be given too many chances. So I think that's been a real boon on one level for film criticism. Earning a living as a film critic, on the other hand, it's been anything but a boon. People have obviously lost the ability largely to earn a living as a film critic over that time frame for a whole raft of reasons that we needn't get into.
But we can if we want to. Diane, Elliot, we're in the St. Louis Film Critics Association. How long have you been in that?
Since the beginning, I was one of the founders.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that? Why a need for a critics association in the area, and how did it develop?
Most of that was to get some studio attention.
Yeah.
Because as you say, we're in St. Louis, and it's like the New Yorker joke. There's New York, and then there's LA, and as you said in your description, we're just the flyover country. And so a lot of it was to do that, and for us to get together and be able to talk to each other, to have really kind of a supportive community. And so that was how, and it was, I remember it was Joe Williams and I met when we decided, and it was a lot of initiative from Joe. I would like to give other people credit. It was a lot of his initiative, and he came to me and said, why don't we talk to this person from Kansas City where they already had a Film Critics Association and see if we can put something together. And I remember meeting down on the river and for breakfast and starting the initiative, which has been very helpful in terms of getting some attention for St. Louis. That has certainly improved enormously. I mean, we're still like, what, the 25th or 28th market or something, so we're never going to be that important. But that doesn't matter. Follow your passion. Do what you're really, really interested in. As I said, be a professional. Get yourself out there. Volunteer. As I heard somebody say yesterday, there isn't on time. There's only early and late. Get to things early. Get involved with those. And then there's one other thing I would say for those of you who are writing film criticism and interested in getting into it, and this is kind of my soapbox that I'm jumping on now and my pet peeve, review the film on the screen, not the one you wish they had made or the one you would like to make. This is one of my pet peeves, is pay attention to the film. Try to help. What I try to do in my writing is to offer my insight into the film, not even that I'm right, but just to help you think about the film. That's what I think the best film criticism is. And so I'm trying to offer some insight into the film that you will see. And I used to say in my film classes, as people testify, I never said, I'm not trying to convince you that my films are the films you should love, but I want you to start understanding your own reaction to the film and the film that you have seen. And if you start advancing in those directions after reading a film critic's article, that to me is success. But for some reason lately, and maybe it's just what I've been exposed to, it's like, well, this is what I wish they had done. And it's like, but that's not what they did. So tell me about what they did do. Review the film that's up there. And the other thing I would say in terms of study is learn about the technical aspects of film. The group that I came from, which were all English teachers in those years, because, as I said, there weren't any film classes, everybody approaches it as though it's just a narrative story, and there are just themes and characters. Well, guess what, folks? There is lighting and editing and composition and camera movement and all kinds of technical things as well. And Pete can really testify to this because he's done a lot of production work. And so also just learn about this package that you're looking at. And I always try in my reviews to say something about a technical element in the film so that people start also understanding and appreciating that. Okay, so end of my soapbox.
No, I love it. You flow perfectly into my next point. You're talking about medium is the message is the medium, form is content, that kind of stuff. But as Cliff pointed out, there's been a huge development to where film criticism is less frequent in print. You're finding a lot of it online, and you're finding it online in various different forms. At the takeup.com, we have a podcast, and Andrew Wyatt and I do film reviews on there. As far as criticism, we go long form into typically older films within series, but then I'm also on KMOV, which is a completely different beast because they do it in an interview form, and I write the questions. They're not listening to this, so no worries there. So it's sort of, I need to think about, this specific medium, how am I going to do a film review by asking myself questions, but also considering what does KMOV's audience want to hear about this? And sometimes it's a bit torturous because for me it's like, that's not film criticism. So I have to kind of compartmentalize myself into the various ways that I do this kind of work, including film programming, which I consider an act of film criticism as well. I'm hoping that Eileen and Elliot can kind of illuminate the various ways in this new media, how you're feeling your way through that landscape and how you think maybe you're adapting your criticism to it, or maybe vice versa.
That's a great question. So my entire career was in terms of film, was based on online content and its ability to be to be disseminated broadly and rapidly. So I feel simultaneous gratitude and dismay because I feel like I missed the opportunity that really ended, I think, in the 90s for print culture criticism, because I also write about visual arts, I also write about politics, I write about a lot of different things, not just film, that there's really not an opportunity to be paid in the way that was not necessarily likely, but plausible in earlier decades. So, I've been teaching at WashU since 2006. I gained a lot of what you're talking about, Diane, in terms of that really fundamental film tutelage. I gained that as a teaching assistant. So as a teaching assistant for about 13 years, I was a teaching assistant for intro to film, some more times than I can count. I think I assisted 3 different professors. I saw professors do a fabulous job teaching intro to film. I also saw professors do a pretty bad job teaching it. And that was actually very helpful because I was on the front lines with the students. How did I become a teaching assistant? Well, because when the English department at WashU was trying to find people to assist the Film and Media Studies department, because WashU does not have actually I shouldn't say department, we don't have a Film and Media Studies department, we have a Film and Media Studies program, right? So we don't have, or we didn't have at the time, this cache of graduate students who could do this kind of labor, which is how universities work. So when I say this kind of labor, I mean adjunct labor or teaching assistantship, like something where you don't have to pay a professor to do some of this work. So I was lucky, but I was also, I think, savvy, I suppose, because when I saw this, I said, I don't actually have a film degree. I don't have a graduate degree in film. But when I was at the University of Rochester, I was immersed in the world of the George Eastman House. I took classes at the George Eastman House. I took classes on film archival. So I impressed upon someone that I knew enough about film to hire me to be a teaching assistant. And that's when I actually really started learning about film. Because when you're teaching something, you learn. So, that's really where I feel like I got a lot of that formal introduction and that formal technique. And so for me, even though I'm primarily teaching online, no matter what I'm writing about, I always at least gesture to what the film looks like on the screen, to the cinematography, to the acting, to the sound. And I think that that's helped me very much because when I started interviewing directors in New York and actors in New York and kind of getting part of the film press world there, I wasn't writing for huge publications. And the only reason why certain publicists would even give me the opportunity to talk to certain people is because they told me, we've been told, like, as soon as you're done with an interview, the director's like, wow, her questions are totally different. She's actually asking me questions about how I made this film. She's actually comparing this film to one of my influences. So the fact that I actually took the film seriously as film, rather than just seeing it as a kind of like, oh, you're famous, tell me what it's about, like, tell me, what was it like to make this film? Or just like stupid questions, like questions that show that you have no experience, essentially. I did so much homework. That's another thing. Like, before I interviewed anybody, before I wrote about anything, I would watch other films. If I didn't know the other films of the director, I would watch at least 2 or 3 other films. If I didn't know all, like with Isabelle Huppert, I watched every film I could within a week. And I was a fan of hers already, but just to impress upon her, like, I know your work, that's one of the ways I advanced in this world, because I didn't have clout simply by virtue of being affiliated with Washington University in St. Louis. Nobody cares about that on the coast. Nobody, and academics aren't necessarily thought of highly either. So I feel like knowing something about how films are made, it's especially filmmakers are going to have tremendous respect for that. And I think that, you know, as far as readers, my writing's probably more academic in certain cases than other critics, and that reflects the world I come from. It's not for everybody. But I also like to write stuff that's not as academic, and so with my short form work, I try to do that more. But I think that, yeah, really, you know, you don't have to become necessarily a resident expert on every aspect of filmmaking, but I think just, like you were saying, paying attention to what's on the screen, paying attention to how something is good. I'm teaching a cultural writing class now, SU, and this is what I'm telling my students, like, it's not enough to summarize the themes, it's not enough to summarize the narrative. Like, you have to actually unpack what's going on in the world of image and the world of sound.
Yeah, they have press releases for those things.
Exactly, and that's
not our
exactly
function.
right. A lot of these reviews, a lot of the film writing these days is a glorified press release.
Yeah, I wouldn't not disagree with that at all. Elliot, your YouTube channel, as I mentioned, is pretty popular, and when I go to it, I see so much interaction on there. So your film criticism, like Eileen, what you're talking about is you write a thing and it's sort of static, right? I mean, it lives on and it has a relationship with the audience.
Sometimes people comment on it.
Yeah. Well, on YouTube, when you subscribe to a channel, you really become a part of a community. So how do you think that's affected what you've done? Do you let it affect it or not?
Well, interesting enough, listening to these great people here as far as like publication goes, I've dabbled in the writing side of it all, but I found my introduction to reviews were online based. YouTube's small, limited podcasting, conversations, deep dives, things of that nature. So I've always kind of what you just alluded to, the idea of like putting myself on camera, sort of something that's like, as the film is, visually something that has an imprint of a timestamp of what my thoughts are of that particular film. And I don't always go back to my old thoughts or reviews, but I just like seeing that time. Just like, I wonder where I was when I saw Mad Max Fury Road in 2015 or whatever the case may be versus, you know, looking online and finding a publication about it. But yeah, the online space of YouTube, or nowadays you have small TikTok reviews and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think the online space of it all is very interesting because, as you just kind of talked about the community aspect, I feel as though you know, when you're sitting there watching someone, and I love very much what you are referring to is digesting a film, interacting with the film, breaking it down, not just from a surface level perspective, but what was it about a particular scene that stood out to you, cinematography wise, placement of the camera, the actor, what the director was going for. Like, that stuff to me is so fascinating, and I think the YouTube space has allowed me to have those conversations in a more in-depth way. Some of my videos are 30 minutes long. I do live streams of 3-hour discussions about films and what have you. So it's a very, really interactive space. It does comes with its toxicity at points, but I find as though the more engaging, informative, insightful comments are the ones that I really engage with the most, because you can just find the beauty of film is I can see something one way and someone else on a completely different time zone across the world can view it in a different perspective, and it's just so eye-opening. So yeah, the online space is very, video online space is a very interesting aspect of film criticism that I've really spent most of my energy and time in, and it's been very exciting.
Can we talk about the comments? Well,
can I jump in on something Eileen said? Because I think this is so important. The homework she did before she interviewed Isabelle Huppert, that makes so much difference, that you know people's work. And this is, again, just being professional, doing your homework. I could tell you so many stories. I love John Waters. I was supposed to interview him one time for 20 minutes, and an hour later, because I knew his work and loved it, they had to pull him away because he just wanted to talk about it. Because, you know, I had a chance to talk to Adam Driver a couple of years ago at Telluride, and I said, I know everybody wants to talk about Kylo Ren, etc., but God, I love Patterson. What? You've seen Patterson? You love Patterson, where he plays the bus driver? Come on, we're going to take a selfie. I said, I don't do selfies. Come on, we're going to... Same thing with Willem Dafoe was there, and I started talking. He was just standing waiting to go in, and I was talking to him, and you just kind of be a little thing. I love your work, and if they obviously don't want to talk, then you respect that. But he wanted to talk, and I said, again, I know everybody wants to talk about this, and this that you've done, but I love Florida Project. Oh my gosh, you've seen Florida. So, I do your homework, learn about the people, and I didn't even know I was going to see these people, but I just love their work, and so fortunately I have. And that will make a huge difference in terms of what you can then put in context in the reviews that you write.
At the Take Up, we dictate what we do there. I mean, we own the site, so we can review something, we'll do a feature, we'll do whatever we want. But it's very often that we'll have the opportunity to review something, and we sort of know between the three of us who's best suited to it because they have the knowledge in it or the experience in it. Like, we'll get offers to cover Hong Sang-soo's new film, which is every month or so.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and we know that's Kayla's thing because Kayla, it's not that anyone else isn't willing to review it, it's that she has the knowledge. And so, especially because the three of us are sort of unabashed auteurists, so we usually write within that framework and that context. The thing I wanted to ask everyone about is access. I think this is a very difficult thing to navigate, but I wanted to talk through, because this is a masterclass, I think people are interested in the day-to-day work. When you're on your own, it can be very difficult unless you make the connections with people, unless you're doing the work and you're starting at, I've got to go, Friday morning or whatever to review Oppenheimer because that's the first showing and I'll do that. But over time, you're invited to early screenings, you'll get things in the mail, you'll get online links. So as you work through it, it becomes easier, but not for everyone. So can you guys take us through what it's like to start getting that access, or some troubles that you might have in gaining materials, gaining readers, anything like that?
Well, I moved to St. Louis in 2017, so I'm originally from Chicago. And I know before I moved to New York and lived in Atlanta for a while, I would go to these websites when I was in Chicago of like early screenings, and you would enter your name to a contest, give them your email, and you get the access to see a film maybe a day or a week before it releases to the public. So I took that mindset when I moved to St. Louis and did the same thing. Which
is something anyone can do. You can go
online.
Yeah,
you can go. Yeah, there's tons of sites out there that allows people, the general public, to see, that can get the access to see these films a bit early. So I did that for, this is dated back 2017, for about 3 years. I would go online. First, email I would see on there, put my information there, and you'd stand in line for an hour, maybe longer, and sometimes you don't get to see the film, which is always a fun thing. But after a while, like I said, I started to notice a similar crowd of people going to these screenings, and that's where I kind of met Acolyte and Sean and things of that nature. They introduced me again to the St. Louis Film Festival. So again, it was my legwork initially. It was like the excitement of seeing films and discovering films, blockbusters, independent films of that nature. And from that, me doing that kind of legwork, it got me in the conversation, networking. And now that days of being the first one to put my email in there to see a film now is kind of in the past, but now I get the opportunity to see these films based on that conversations and meeting people and so on and so forth. So the access is a blessing to see films a little bit earlier, just with my 9 to 5 job. Being able to see something, having time to digest it, getting time to review it, it has been a blessing for sure. So yeah, having access is a game changer.
I was lucky enough to do the Tellurites Student Symposium in 2017, and one of my faculty members was the great Linda Williams. And she said to me, "You seem smart, you seem sharp. Try to be the first. Try to be one of the first to do these things. Because when you have your voice out there, people are curious. People want to know what this new Schrader film is. Write the review. Put it out there. People will find you. And if you have talent and you think you're good at it and people like what you're doing, they're going to gravitate to you. But I think, as everyone said, you have to kind of keep plugging away at it too."
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for those who don't know, our audience members, there's a single source basically nowadays in St. Louis to get early access, and that's Allied. They're the publicist for all the major studios. And honestly, it's just a matter of writing consistently enough, whether self-published through a blog, something of that nature, or publication. They'll recognize you and seek you out because you have some degree of an audience, and they'll put you on the list, and you'll get invited to press screenings. I do think that there's some value in being first, but by the same token, I always like to read film criticism after I've seen the film as opposed to before, because what I'm looking for is insight into the film, not whether I should go or not. I don't regard this as a consumer guide, but rather something that's going to teach me something about the film. And I may violently disagree with the conclusions reached by that critic, but by the same token, it stimulates my own thoughts and creates responses to what it is they're saying. So I don't put a huge value on being first out of the box, but I do understand, particularly in establishing your voice and getting sort of known in the world and drawing an audience in, that being there first is helpful. Allied, by the way, doesn't control everything, and so you still end up having to develop a huge number of other kinds of relationships with the smaller distributors who will largely not put films on screen, but rather send you links to screeners. So I was lucky in the sense that obviously I spent 20 years or so with Cinema St. Louis, and so we had those relationships built in because we played their movies and therefore we receive access. It's a more difficult thing if you're operating independently, especially, to make those initial connections. But basically they want their films to be seen. So they're going to, if they think you're legitimate and not just scamming them to see the movie for free, they'll eventually say, yes, we'll put you on the list and you'll receive access.
And volunteer for Cinema St. Louis. That's a great way to get involved, is to go that route. But since filmmakers are storytellers, I'm going to tell you another story from Telluride, because there's so many people there and all these panels and all. And this is a Bruce Dern story that he told a couple of years ago, and he was in the Actors Studio in New York. And nobody knew who he was, and he told Kazan, "I want to go to Hollywood. I'm ready to go to Hollywood. I'm going to become a movie star." And Kazan said, "You're terrible. You're never going to become a movie star. You're not ready to go to Hollywood. Don't even think about it." He said, "You go to Hollywood, you're going to be the third Indian on the right, just standing there doing nothing." And Dern said, "I'm going to Hollywood, and I'm going to be the best damn third Indian on the right they've ever seen." And he did, and started making connections, and just put himself out there, and started working with Hitchcock, et cetera, et cetera. He was at Telluride for Nebraska, which I think is just a brilliant film. So, just keep working so hard. Jack Nicholson, when he would, in his earliest years, tried out for audition for all these things, and he wasn't getting anything. And all of his buddies would say, "Hey, come on, let's all go out, get something to drink, he didn't get picked, et cetera, et cetera." And he said, "No, I didn't get picked, I'm going home and working." And he'd go home and stand in front of his mirror for 3 hours and practice lines and reactions and study, work. So the best way to not be overlooked is to be so good that they can't ignore you.
I was going to say that, so one of the downsides of this explosion of online content is that it's really easy for different film communities to not know that other film communities exist. Right? So I had all my access to films and film screeners and film screenings in New York. I lived in St. Louis. All of my access was getting invited to screenings in New York for about 6 or 7 years. Like I think I only got added to the Allied list maybe a couple years ago, and I was on Rotten Tomatoes for years before that, writing for national publications. And I don't think it's because Allied Media had anything against me. I think it's because they didn't know, because I wasn't writing for local and regional publications. So you could be writing for a site that has a kind of national presence, and your own community cannot necessarily know you're doing it. At least that was my experience. And so I had to contacted Cinema St. Louis and said, "Hey, I'd like to cover the International Film Festival. I've been, paying to go and see as many films as I can. And the International Film Festival in St. Louis is fantastic. It's one of the things I prioritize writing about every year because I think it's genuinely an incredible festival. You did a great job for all the. I mean, I know that you're not the only person, but anyone involved in it did a great job and continues to do a great job. But I do think there's a way in which local and regional publications and the film communities that come from that, like the film critic communities that come from that, can sometimes be very separated from the rest of what's going on with film writing. And so I get almost all my screeners now from New York publicists, and most of those are international films and independent films that are not going to have the big screenings here in St. Louis. So I'm grateful for that, but I also think that one of the things that happened during the pandemic democratized the film screening experience. So before, I almost had to find a way to get to New York in person if I wanted to go to certain screenings. Because of the pandemic, it really democratized things because screeners became a lot more typical. So that actually helps if you're in flyover country, because you don't have to be on the coast to go to some of these screenings. You can get a link. So I think that the point is, if you want to write and you publish about film locally, that's wonderful. Regionally, that's wonderful. If you do it nationally, don't expect that the people who are local or regional are going to know you did it, because it's not the same community. They don't necessarily intersect. So I think I learned that kind of late, frankly. So I think that just making sure that you're not just assuming people will know who you are because you're publishing. You have to reach out and say, hey, I'm doing this. I'm also interested in the local community. I'm also interested in what's going on within my own region. But I will say the fact that I had the calendar academically to be in New York for maybe 2 months to 3 months for many consecutive summers helped me enormously. And I want to be transparent about that, because if I didn't have that luxury, if I didn't have the luxury of that time off, there's no way I would have had that kind of access. Absolutely not. So I've made the most of it in terms of hustling and networking, but I also think that that was a great advantage, which would not have happened if I had stayed here. So it doesn't mean it's impossible to become a film critic if you can't do that. It just means that it's harder to get kind of imbricated in that very small film publicity world that really kind of anything that's independent, international, etc. is usually connected to these different publicists. So I was very, very lucky. I took advantage of that luck, but I was also very lucky, and I think I want to acknowledge that, because otherwise it would be unfair.
Absolutely. There's a level of privilege that you have
Absolutely.
to have to
I had privilege in
Yeah.
having the summer off. Otherwise, there's no way I could have done it.
You mentioned your 9 to 5. I also work 9 to 5 too, completely different job. So sometimes it's difficult, but I have the privilege of being able to sort of support myself to get this thing going to where eventually you get paid for things.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
If anyone's listening, maybe you can just transition your day job into a film job. It's rayjoshua.cw@gmail.com.
Could I add something too about the access part of it all? And it's something that was mentioned earlier as far as volunteering and putting yourself out there. I remember prior to gaining access to the St. Louis Film Festival or Film Association was I would reach out via DMs or LinkedIn or email to publicists or directors or producers that I would do the research and find their information, because a lot of stuff is available online. And rather than hey, can I just see your film to talk about it, I would have give them a say portfolio or the work I've done before, and putting myself out there. So that whole idea of again, putting yourself out there, volunteering and reaching out and not having that fearfulness of oh, they're never going to respond. It is amazing how often people do respond to you. And I'm referring to, I've spoken to several actors and directors via Instagram DMs of just excitement of wanting to see your film and getting the word out there and this, that, and the third. So that is another thing I would suggest, is just not being afraid to ask. The worst that can happen is no response, or let me see a couple things prior to me giving you access to that. So definitely something I recommend is accessibility of putting yourself out there and not being afraid to ask for the access.
Pitching is critical.
Yeah.
These days, most film criticism, as Cliff pointed out earlier, full-time jobs are super scarce. So a lot of people who even did it for a very long time are now working freelance full time. So pitch, pitch, pitch. And again, what's the worst that's going to happen is someone doesn't respond. But at the inverse, I want to take this back to the idea of what we're here for. This is the St. Louis Filmmakers Showcase. I am sometimes pitched to review local filmmakers, smaller independent filmmakers' films that may never get seen. I want to know what you think the role is of the film critic in the community at large, especially with a smaller filmmaking community like we have locally here.
As a person who has both covered and also presented local film for many, many, many years, I think it's imperative that film critics be open to covering local film. Now, that doesn't mean that they should necessarily use the same exact critical lens that you're going to bring to a major Hollywood film or major international film. You do have to, I think, take into consideration the ways in which this film was created. There's going to be all sorts of pressures and difficulties that are brought to bear for a local filmmaker that other people aren't necessarily going to have to confront. So there are probably different bars that you're expecting people to clear. By the same token, I also think that you need to be honest. You need to give tough love in the sense that if somebody has really made a truly awful film, or one that's just sort of misconceived, and they need to hear that. They shouldn't be just satisfied with having made the film. They also need to be told whether they made a good film and why. So I think it's imperative that local film critics be open to that. And unfortunately, because of the way in which publications now work, there's less space in which to address that. When I was at the Riverfront Times, when I was at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I insisted on reviewing everything that was available when we were doing something like Filmmakers Showcase or the St. Louis International Film Festival. We did capsules. That's disappeared. That doesn't happen anymore. Everything's very highly selective, and they give a shot at various things, but they don't necessarily do the sort of comprehensive coverage that I'm more inclined to promote.
I love supporting local filmmakers, having taught film production for decades at Merrimack. But as Cliff said, you have to be honest or you lose your own credibility. So, but you can be honest and say, this is a very good first feature. This would be a good documentary for people who are interested in X topic without misrepresenting the level of complexity and accomplishment. So I like to cover review the films that are from local filmmakers, but putting it into the context is also important.
Well, you're a filmmaker yourself. How have you dealt with criticism of your work?
I actually love criticism because, as I have often said, a good critic is worth their weight in gold. If you can, it's hard sometimes to hear it. I say, yeah, criticize me, I love it, beat me up. But you can learn so much. And of course you also, exactly what Cliff was saying, you may completely disagree with somebody's review, but still learn a lot from it. I may think you're not reviewing the film I just made, but I might be able to learn something from that particular approach. So I like criticism, but evaluate the criticism. Some of it is very, very good and very helpful. I've gotten the most serious criticism, and this is along the lines also of keep working, keep involved, keep learning. I just came back last night from a 3-day University Film Video Association conference where I showed the documentary on fair use that I had made with a co-director. And the criticism, the reaction, especially from these professional colleagues, is very, very helpful for anything that I'll be doing in the future.
I'm just going to add to that I think that, especially for freelance film critics, it can sometimes feel more intimidating to write a negative review, because if you write a negative review of a film you may fear that you're not going to get the same kind of access to screeners, the same kind of access to whatever. Like, why, like I have had in my head sometimes, well, why would they keep sending me films if I'm just going to say that they're not very good? But I will say that hasn't been my experience. I actually think that some of the more, I don't want to necessarily say scathing, but some of the more directly critical pieces I wrote, especially early in my career as a film critic, established my credentials, that I wasn't afraid to say, okay, maybe I disagree with the general consensus. And sometimes that's not just criticizing a film, it could also be defending a film that other people say sucks and you think it doesn't. So I think that like being willing to go against the grain as a film critic and not just create what people want to see is part of what can also establish your credentials. And I usually warn a film publicist if I know the person or have any kind of positive, correspondence with them, like, hey, this review is not going to be positive, just so that they know in advance. But that doesn't mean that they won't resent the fact that they've given you the screener, because really all of this is about creating a conversation, a larger conversation. And conversations are totally boring if everyone agrees, and it's just repeating the same thing back and forth. So the way I see it is that, if I'm reviewing a film that was, a first film that does some things well and does some things really poorly. I actually just wrote a review of a film that was a first film that I thought wasn't that great. I acknowledged what it did well, and I don't feel as though I'm doing that director a disservice or that film a disservice, because simply the fact that I've spent hours thinking about it and hours writing about it in a conscientious way, and the fact that it will exist, means more people will know that the film exists. And they may be more likely to see it just because of its topic. They may be, so they will be more likely to know the filmmaker exists. So I think I had this idea of like, reviews have to be positive because someone worked so hard.
Yeah.
Or I recently wrote a negative review of a documentary for Hyperallergic, and there was a comment on there where someone said, like, at least this film was made. And we're like, yeah, I spent, 2 hours watching it, and I spent another 2 hours rewatching it, and then I spent hours writing it. Like, I'm glad the film was made. I don't have a problem with the film being made. So I think that, like, we live in a very polarized age. Sometimes people get very upset online. I'm sure you've seen this even more. This is why I can't do YouTube. I have a very demonstrative face. A very demonstrative face. There's no way I would survive on YouTube, like, with some of the comments that would come flying my way. I just think, like, we live in an age that's very polarized. It's even more important, I think, for conscientious, like, honest reviews to exist, because it shouldn't be considered mean-hearted to say something critical. So that's all.
I was going to add to that as far as the honesty, and number one, to go back to Josh's question, as far as, like, yes, 100% support local filmmaking. Back where I'm from, Chicago, I have a friend of mine who is a independent filmmaker, and every now and then he'll send me the link to his new film, just to not even necessarily to criticize it, but just, what do you take and opinion on this, that, and the third. So yes, 100% love supporting independent filmmaking. Very important to do. But then to the whole conversation about criticism, I think for me, always trying to find, because again, yes, making a film is incredibly hard. Going to made films myself, and a part of films that have been entered into film festivals is a very tough task, but that doesn't shield it from criticism. And I think for me, when I criticize movies, shows, whatever the case may be, I try my best to explain where my criticism is stemming from, rather than that sucked or that was bad. It's like, well, why? So that's one of my biggest. I think with the criticism side of it, whether it's a filmmaker, writer, if I'm criticizing performance, it's where's that coming from? Why did I feel as though it didn't fully hit the mark or fully develop a particular plot or story, whatever the case would be? Is explaining myself enough to understand where that criticism comes from. And with that criticism, I've had directors, again, going back to like the access of it all, hey, can you check out my film and give them feedback, whatever, explaining what I felt, why it didn't work for me or land for me, versus this is bad because of without explanation. So I think explaining yourself helps, understand where that comes from. So.
And you shouldn't fear criticism.
Yeah.
Obviously you shouldn't fear criticism, good and bad. But bad, where you're giving negative feedback, as long as it's informed and thoughtful, that's helpful to the filmmaker, as Diane pointed out. And also, it doesn't hurt you. Ultimately, you may fear that the publicist or whomever is going to somehow react poorly to a negative piece and then deny you access at some future point. Back when I was at the RFT, initially I struggled with whether or not we should go on junkets. These things don't exist so much as in the same way anymore. But back in the day, you'd be invited to see a film or multiple films in New York, LA, wherever it was set, and you'd go. It was a very artificial environment in which you'd sit around with other quote-unquote film critics, as Eileen pointed out. Some of those people were not really film critics. They're just sort of fanish folks who ask really inane questions. But you are given the opportunity to actually interact with the filmmakers. My own attitude is that I'll accept it, and I sent Diane on many of these and other folks. And I would simply say to myself, if I don't like the movie, I am obligated to write about it, but I don't have to write about it positively, and I accepted the consequences of that. If they then decided, we're not inviting you back, okay, that's fine. Did it ever happen? No. All publicity is good publicity. The fact that I was obligated to write about it accomplished their goal. Whatever I said, it gets the name of the film in circulation within St. Louis. So I never got any blowback whatsoever for writing a negative piece from a junket that I attended. And Diane certainly never held back in what she wrote. So you shouldn't ever fear that. You should never allow that to influence what it is you write about the movie.
And what people want from a film critic is that honesty, but also the unique voice. So they want to know. They're returning. Some folks are just returning, what do they think of new Indiana Jones? But a lot of critics, the great critics, you're returning, I want to know what Richard Brody thought of the new Indiana Jones. Yeah, I don't think he's written about it yet, and I am curious. But on that note, I want to leave a little bit of space for questions. So if you want to think of a question, I have just one thing, quick hits. If there's one piece of criticism, maybe a book, a feature that really encapsulates what you love about film criticism, what is it?
I have really recently been enjoying Manohla Dargis for the New York Times.
The best.
Yeah, because she really, she comes from my left brain, right brain approach, because she always talks about technical things as well as, the acting and the story. And it just, I don't always agree with her. We're never going to find somebody we agree with all the time. I don't always agree with myself after I go back and see a movie 10 years later and go, what the heck was I thinking? Where was I then? But she helps me think about the movie. I think she's very insightful. She's certainly very knowledgeable. I used to like A.O. Scott, but I always said he's more of an essayist than a film reviewer. He's not always all that good on film. He's a terrific essayist, so he just retired as the critic, and I think it was exactly the right thing for him to do. He's writing essays now. He's a terrific essayist, but I really like Dargis because of her approach, and obviously you do too.
I really like reading the old Renata Adler criticism. I think Renata Adler has such a distinctive voice. The kind of rivalry she had with Pauline Kael, I think, is really insightful and hilarious at times, just in terms of, I think especially a lot of times these days there's this idea that women can't disagree with each other, or we have to just automatically support each other, otherwise we're hurting each other. And I think Renata Adler and Pauline Kael were so powerful as female film critics, but wrote in such wildly different ways. And I think that was something I learned from. Even though I 100% agree with you about A.O. Scott, I do think his book, Better Living Through Criticism, is a good book. Mm-hmm. I've taught it before, and he says he defends criticism as its own art form. Mm-hmm. And I think both pedagogically and creatively, that's helped me, because I take it seriously as an art form. I do think it's important to do it well, to think about your form when you're writing, in addition to content. And he really lays that out beautifully in the book.
I have so many critics that I'm such a big fan of. I can't list one of those on the moment. I can't think of anyone off the top, but I know from an online space. There's content creators by the name of Double Toasted who had a website, probably like early 2010, 2011 of film criticism, and they've transformed into video form. And the thing I like about their kind of commentary on movies is just the conversational aspect of filmmaking, and just the way I approach a lot of my video reviews is just having a conversation with someone, whether it is analytical, having fun with the film, what I loved about it, what stood out to me. So they bring that fun side of criticism out, where it's just a conversation amongst your friends on a couch. You just got done watching the movie. What did you think? Type of approach. So I've always gravitated towards those more fun, interactive, with a hint of comedy every now and then, and personalizing it as well, because that's the unique thing about film criticism, is just that I can see something completely different from another film critic. So Double Toast is definitely a format or a critic that I go to just to kind of get their take on it, with a little bit of comedy mixed in.
Because of when I grew up as a film critic, the sort of twin stars of the era, Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael, both heavily influenced how I approached film. I also have a huge fondness for James Agee on film. He's the person who probably exerted the strongest influence over my own, for better or worse, style. The film critic who I probably most respect and who I continue to look toward over and over again is Robin Wood. He's the person who I think is most interesting, compelling to me as a film critic. His growth over time, his evolution as a critic, his willingness to sort of self-critique, all of that really terrific. Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan and Personal Views are two of my favorites, but also his works on specific directors, particularly Hitchcock and Hawks, are absolutely essential.
And then we were just talking about Hitchcock's.
And last, as far as somebody, I love Dargis's work, but I also like Stephanie Zaharek from Time Magazine. I think Stephanie does a really good job within the context of just sort of ongoing engagement with contemporary film in a very accessible way. I think she's a really terrific writer and also quite insightful in what she has to say.
I'll just say one other name, Joe Morgenstern, I think when he was writing for the Wall Street Journal, was also very good. He really encapsulated things well.
I started loving film criticism when the online boom happened. That what I referenced at the beginning was slantmagazine.com, and I think they continue to have great critics. And one of their critics is actually a local theater owner, the Arcadon Cinnamon Bars, owned by Keith Watson, who contributes to Slant Magazine. But they've got a great archive. Ed Gonzalez, Fernando Croce, some excellent criticism. All right, I think we have a few moments for questions. You want me to wrap it?
I'll wonder.
Okay.
One last thing I wanted to add, and it would be a mistake not to acknowledge this. Joshua is, of course, a fine critic himself, but his colleague at the Take Up, Andrew Wyatt, I think is an extraordinary film critic who deserves much more national recognition than probably he has, at least up to this point, received. And I would encourage you, please, if you have not yet visited the Take Up, you should, both Joshua's work, Andrew's work, and then Kayla McCullough, who is also
my favorite critic.
She's a young critic who is still sort of learning on the job, but is also quite fascinating in her insights.
Yeah, she's teaching me a lot.
So over time, you've discussed how the dynamic of film criticism and how it gets out into the world has changed with the preponderance of internet sites and everything too. But to that point, any idiot with an internet access can create a website and say, hey, I'm a film critic. How does that dilute your craft? And clearly it has diluted your ability to earn a consistent income for the masses. Less people can do that. Anybody can do that, but how does that, some are more right-wing and some are clearly more left-wing, but how does that dilute, what you're really trying to do? Does that affect your ability to properly does that cloud and diminish what you're trying to do?
I don't think so. I think the cream always rises to the top. I is that the phrase? I think that if you have an original voice and you're have talent for film criticism, those are the people who are getting focused. Now, whether they're getting paid or not is a different question. But you're right in that it does sort of dilute the industry because now you have film trailers that don't have critical quotes. They have tweets and user reviews from Rotten Tomatoes. So as far as like within the critical community, I think again, always if you have an original voice and have a talent for writing or any other means that we all do film criticism, you're still at an advantage for other people. But that is to acknowledge that, yeah, we're in a bad spot as far as an industry and getting paid for these things.
Interesting enough, I had probably a 3-hour conversation with some fellow film critics about a conversation that just recently was sparked with the most recent strikes with the writers and actors is influencers versus a film critic. And I think a lot of people have kind of blurred the lines of what an influencer is versus what a film critic is. So to kind of answer your question, I think the authenticity of what you're putting out there shines through more than just a 60-second, advertisement versus actually criticizing something. So I think people are smart enough to distinguish between someone that's just putting out their thoughts on something in a very surface level manner versus someone that's actually having an analytical conversation about something. So
If you're just surfing the web, sometimes there's just so much clutter there. That's the tough thing, that you have to work your way, break through the clutter to find the authentic voices, the good voices.
I remember that the Film Critics Association had somewhat of a bloodletting at one point when they had to be more serious about the ones who were just, hey, I got a website, listen to me, because they wanted the stuff. They wanted the free stuff, and they really weren't doing it for an altruistic reason or for the art. Not for the art of it, they're doing it for the jazziness of it. And it was a diluted voice.
Yep.
I used to take classes from Diane, and she said, "I've already wasted my money. I'm not going to waste my time." So you weren't afraid to walk out of a movie if it was really bad. And I just want to know, do you as critics always push through after the first act, and you're just like, I don't like this at all? Do you always push through, or can you still just say or turn it off or walk out of the movie?
Unless I have committed to reviewing it, then I would never do that, of course. But I actually know a film critic one time who would walk out halfway through and still review the film, which I think is completely unprofessional and unethical. So if I'm going to review it, in fact, I usually I leave. If I have a link, I'll probably watch it more than once. But if I'm just going on my own and I'm just going to go see this movie, I probably walked out of more movies than most people I know. Because within about the first, are mostly series on television. I can't tell you how many I started and stopped within 10, 15 minutes. It doesn't take very long to know this either really has something behind it or not. So, no, I still abide by that.
I have an obsessive compulsive need to watch anything that I start. So I never walk out of anything. Even films that I really despise, I'll continue to watch. And part of this was conditioning too from the festival. I always felt that if a filmmaker, they have to pay us money in order to submit their work. So I always felt that it was imperative that we watch it from start to finish, even if in the first 15 minutes I recognize that this is never a film that we're going to play. I nonetheless felt sort of duty bound to continue on and watch it. But that also applies to just things that I'm seeing in the theater or watching at home. I never stop.
I think one of the things that's nice about freelancing now, even though I do wish that there were opportunities to work full-time as a critic, is that I don't really write about films that I don't think are interesting to write about.
Yeah.
So even when I write something negative, it's usually because I think the reason I have is interesting. Because there are plenty of films I don't like, and there, frankly, are plenty of films I do like where I think my reasons are pretty boring. So why write about it? I think for freelancers, I mean, I'm very rarely in a situation where I've agreed to write about a film without having seen it first. So because of that, I definitely walk out of films because I'm not obligated to write about them. You know, I've shown up, I'm going to see it, and I get screeners all the time. A lot of them aren't very good. So the way I feel about it is I'm not obligated to finish it because I haven't committed to writing about it. And if it's not interesting, good or bad, no matter what I'm writing about, if I don't think I have an interesting reason to like or dislike something or have ambivalence about it, I just don't want to write about it at all. So that's one good thing about being a freelancer is that you don't have to write about something you don't think, that you want to finish, essentially. Yeah.
Filmmakers are artists and very passionate about what they do. What's the worst thing that someone has said to you for one of your reviews? I myself have received 2 death threats as a programmer over time. Not serious ones because I'm still standing here, but people get mad. So what's something that people have said to you that are just totally out of line? Just curious.
I really need to start resisting the urge to look at the comments. I have to do it. When they
It's unhealthy.
YouTube, it's so unhealthy. I'll talk to my therapist about it someday. But the other day I saw one that says, I think some critics just want to review something negatively. And no, I don't know about all of you, but I am more than excited when something I didn't expect to like at all ends up thrilling me in a very surprising way. It's one of the great experiences of watching movies. And I don't think anyone's going in with any sort of eye, at least to maintain our integrity as film critics. We shouldn't. Of course, I'm super excited to see the new Todd Haynes film. But if I see it and it's a piece of crap, I know it won't be. I will negatively review it, and the inverse is also true. I think the worst, the most I've had to resist the impulse is very recent with The Little Mermaid. I had to get out of there. Someone get me out of there. But I watched it for some reason.
Well, yeah, coming from the online space, comment sections are very hazardous, but I've always looked at it in the sense it's just my personality. I just laugh at it, negative comments, and I've gotten tons of, especially with a recent film like A Little Mermaid or even recently Barbie, which I enjoyed. But I just laugh at it. I'll spit it back on the commenter as far as just playing on there. Either sometimes their comments are like incorrectly spelled, so I'll point that out to them. But on the positive note, I actually have found some really encouraging comments that have moved me, whether I was in a bad spot for the day or someone reaches out to me via DM saying, some people might think it's crazy, but when people actually can connect with the film and other people connect and have that conversation, it can be moving. I've had people reach out to me and say, hey, I saw this film with my daughter, or you recommended this film to me and my son to watch, and such a great experience. So I take the negative and replace it with all the 20,000 other great comments I've seen and just kind of laugh at, like I said, those people. If you took the time to, number one, watch or read a review of mine and then, put your 2 cents in there, then it's like, I'll even thank you for putting that time in there, even if it is negative. So yeah.
I feel similarly if someone is polite and diplomatic and disagrees. Like I'll say, oh, I totally like I recently what you described, Josh, as far as like not expecting to like a movie. That I just had that with Barbie. I thought Barbie would be okay, and I found it. I really enjoyed it, and that was a surprise. But with that movie, I mean, I'm known as a feminist film critic. I run in those circles, and there are plenty of people who disagree with me, and that's their right. That's okay. So if someone will respond and say, like, well, I thought this is this, will be like, well, thank you for reading, my 900-word review. Thank you for taking this time out of your day. So I always try to respond with that. As far as the most negative comments I've gotten for a review, I don't know, because I know that they were probably when I was writing for Salon, and Salon was notorious at the time for having hundreds and hundreds of comments. and there was no opportunity for the editors to really take down the ones that were like deeply misogynistic and insulting. So I just didn't read them ever. I remember I wrote about the Jason Bourne movies, and I really love the Jason Bourne franchise. I've watched his movies multiple times, and I could tell just by looking at the top 2 comments that the people who were commenting didn't read the piece, assumed that I was like harshly rebuking the Jason Bourne franchise. Why? Because I'm female and because the title was provocative. When in fact, if they had read it, they would have realized, no, she's watched these multiple times, and this is like, if anything, kind of a defense of certain aspects of this franchise. So I don't know. I think you have to. I mean, I admire the fact that you just engage it and can laugh it off. If you're not the kind of person who can laugh it off, don't subject yourself to it. If you know it's going to be nasty, it's very different. Something like that is very different than someone emailing me and saying I disagreed with this and this, or Facebook or Twitter saying I didn't have the same response as you did. Something like that. It's like, thank you for reading this. You gave me your time. That's more than anyone. That's about as much as I can expect, I should say.
Yeah, and it's actually nice. Sorry, Diane. It's actually nice to get some feedback like that, in the sense that when I was reviewing primarily back in the 80s and 90s at the Riverfront Times, the only feedback that I received would be a very occasional letter to the editor. And people who will take the time to write a letter to the editor are almost always negatively influenced. They didn't like what you had to say and therefore feel compelled to share it. You didn't receive positive feedback, and I felt like I was just sort of writing in a void at times. Nobody ever said anything to me. It was sort of heartening later when I was at the Cinema St. Louis that many filmmakers and other people would come up to me after the fact, well after the fact, decades in some cases after the fact, saying, "Hey, I used to read you all the time. I loved your work." Well, why didn't you tell me then? So it is nice to occasionally get some positive feedback, but even negative feedback, as long as it's polite and is informed and has some sort of rigor to what it is they have to say, is still welcome. That's what we're doing. We should be able to take it in return.
And is about the film.
Yes,
It is
right.
about the film.
Right, yeah. I would say more of my negative feedback was when I was teaching, and I would always run discussion classes, and sometimes students would say, "I absolutely hated that film you just showed us." And for me, I was like Eileen and Cliff and Elliot. Let's talk about why. What was there? Let's explore more. Because I really did want to understand what about the film was so off-putting, because I keep learning about my own taste and reactions, etc. So exactly as you said, if it's polite and thoughtful, I'm really interested in a different point of view and a different perspective. And in terms of going in and wanting to write a negative review, I'm not a masochist. I don't want to go, when I go into a film, I'm optimistic, and as you said, I'm so happy when it exceeds my expectations. Like, oh, I didn't think I was going to love this, and this is great. It's, that's a good day. But I always go in thinking, I'm going to like this movie. And unfortunately, sometimes, most of the time I do, because I pick pretty carefully, but sometimes if you don't, you don't.
I have to be a little careful sometimes because local filmmakers are passionate about what they do, but also have, like me, very thin skins and do not want the tough love that I give them in return when they ask the questions. And I make them ask me many times before I answer, and it never turns out well. And I wish it were better. Only one time in 25 years has it turned out right. So that's a low batting average. Cliff has seen my rage in action before over time. And you work so hard on something, or you want to be truthful to everyone in the process, and when you get punched in the face by being honest, you're not doing the audience any favor for hugging something that's terrible.
Kind of looking more recently, a couple of you have kind of mentioned being surprised by films. You mentioned Barbie, being surprised by that. What other, from everybody, what other films have you been surprised by, like within the last year or two? Or, I mean, you can go back as far as you want.
Mission Impossible
Yes.
Dead Reckoning Part
I
1
loved it.
was one of the more thrilling experiences I've had in the theater in years. And I mean this as an action film with expertly mounted action set pieces, but also on a theoretical level, what it has to say about digital versus analog, but the deployment of those themes through this very carefully done wind-up toy was just exciting, and the amount of style and thought put into every single frame of that. I like those movies. There's a Brian De Palma, we're fans, a Brian De Palma film in there too, and I think it's the best one. It's one of the best films of the year. And that was the kind of reaction I had. It's like, all right, here we go to the next one. Why is it 3 hours? And then by the time it was almost over, there was a point where it had this great reference, and I won't spoil it in case anyone's not seen it yet, for a specific film that is sort of the genesis of action filmmaking that choked me up. Like, I cried during Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning. Fine. Yes.
I love that.
I felt the same way. I went in, I knew I would like it because I started watching it when it was on television. It's like, you guys already got me. You know, I'm going to like this no matter what you do. And I really like Tom Cruise. I love his physicality. But I was just overwhelmed at how good it was. And I also love the Jason Bourne things. In fact, if I'm flipping channels looking for something and you see Jason Bourne, my husband will go, oh no, because he knows we're going there.
All hail Tom Cruise. The film that I was probably most surprised by, not recently, but Top Gun Maverick, similarly had that sort of adrenalizing aspect to it. I despised Top Gun. Gave it a negative review when it came out. Again, showing how old I am. But I was really quite taken by the film, and I think a lot of it does have to do with Cruise's sort of analog approach to filmmaking. The fact that he sort of is so hyper committed to the role and being present in the film as opposed to computer generated within it. So there's something to be said for that, as much as I find Tom Cruise a difficult and problematic personality on other
As a person is another thing, but yeah, his commitment to what he does is insane, but it's thrilling to watch.
I feel like I guys saw Talk to Me, the press screening for Talk to Me, and I love a horror movie that will surprise me, and I think horror is an interesting genre because you can, for very little money, do something terrifying. And it's because of people being creative. And so that's something I really enjoy with that genre. I don't review a lot of horror films, but there's been 3 in the last couple years that I'm going to name that are all outstanding. 2 of them are by first-time female filmmakers. I don't actually know as much about Talk to Me. But Talk to Me is recent. It's coming out, or it's actually forthcoming. It's an Australian film. It's A24. It's creative, it's scary, it's a lot of fun, I think. It's funny. The 2 others I wanted to mention, one is, I believe, a Finnish film called Hatching that I saw at Sundance a couple years ago. Brilliant film about a 13-year-old girl. Also very scary, but in a different way. And then the other one was Relic, which I thought if I could have seen, I would so happily pay a lot of money to see it on the big screen because I saw it during lockdown. And my partner and I watched it more than once and were terrified more the second time around because we didn't notice this whole thing going on the first time around. So horror is a genre that is hit or miss for me, but when it's good, it often really surprises me. And I'm excited about the fact that there are new voices coming into horror who are really digging into what's scary about things from a perspective that is often a female perspective, the perspective of a person of color, a queer perspective, and that historically hasn't been as true. So I think it's a really exciting time for that genre now. Even though it's not necessarily my favorite genre, I think it's an exciting time for that genre.
As someone that horror is my favorite genre,
Okay, there you go.
I couldn't agree with you more. Talk to Me. I think it comes out next week. thing I love about it is the
Talk to me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Talk to
yeah,
Me.
yeah.
So clever. It's so
Yes,
clever. It's one thing I
very
will
smart.
admit with horror. A lot of tropes. We've seen the thing 1,000 times, but this takes a very unique trope that we've seen before, but has its own unique spin that I absolutely love. And the ending is one of
Oh,
my
it's
favorite
great
things
ending.
here. But I will go and say Oppenheimer. I'm a Christopher Nolan fan. And I know one of his biggest criticisms is Christopher Nolan doesn't know how to do emotion or human connection, which I think is watching Interstellar. But I was just shocked by how, from a technical standpoint, and knowing that a lot of the stuff that they used to make recreating the Trinity and no CGI was just amazing. And there's just so many great performances, but there's I didn't know how terrifying the film would be from a sense of going back to my love of horror. There are some really horrific, not like on-screen, interpretations of like horror, but like the idea of what was created, and the idea of like literally this would have been a world destroyer, and how ego can sometimes cloud that decision. So I was just so shocked by how terrifying Oppenheimer was, as well as just brilliantly made.
Incredibly tense. Three hours.
3
I
hours.
was like, this needs to come with a health warning.
I'll mention one other film, and I'm not a big horror fan necessarily, but and a film I would have never predicted I would like, Prey, which is available on Hulu.
Wouldn't expect
It
you
was
to like that.
it was a Predator sequel, and it's like, what? I thought that was quite extraordinary and had a lot of intriguing things to say.
Another one that I thought was, well, it surprised me a lot, but I'm kind of a sports fanatic, was Air. Went in not expect. I mean, I thought I'm going to enjoy this just because it's about Michael Jordan and the Nike making the shoes, the Air Jordan, and I was just totally entertained. I think Matt Damon ought to be getting an Academy Award nomination for that. I thought he was, but just all of the casting, I thought was terrific, and how much they kept Jordan in the background, yet it was all about him.
I'll throw in Blackberry too. Speaking on like things that are made, Blackberry is a great film. It's fantastic.
So you guys live in kind of a world where you get pre-screeners and you can see films ahead of time, but do you still like the opening night, big crowd, popcorn experience? And if you do, if you go see the movies like opening night, does that affect your critique in any way when you're hearing big audience reaction?
Your experience with the thing in front of you, film criticism lies somewhere in between this, right? So it's about the thing, but it's also about your experience with it. And while we all say, we're trying to be objective about the thing, I don't believe that. And I know that my surroundings and circumstances will affect the relationship that I have with it, but I'm willing to let that relationship change over time too, and let different experiences inform the way I'm seeing it. We saw Asteroid City in a pre-screening pretty early, about 3 weeks before it was released. And it was a lot of film critics, and we watch a lot of movies, but it had a pretty positive response in it. But then I turn around and I loved the movie, but I went to see it opening weekend because I loved it so much, and it's so incredibly dense that I immediately needed to have that experience again, and was completely enriched by seeing it with an audience too. There were things in it that I didn't realize that were funny, and things that critics laughed at that the public didn't laugh at. This is a film about art and making art and thinking about art. But of course, that relationship can change based upon the circumstances. I mean, if you see something in a film festival at 11 p.m. at night, you're probably not going to give it the ideal experience it might deserve. I mean, the first time I saw it, Chloe Zhao's the writer, I saw it 11 p.m. and that's a very sleepy and dreamy film. And when I saw it a second time, I actually liked it considerably less because I found it a little more literal than I had seen it the first time, probably because I was sleep deprived. So.
No, I think that's a great question, and I actually worry about that because I've mentioned Telluride so many times, and actors, directors, producers, or people are always there with their films, and so there's a halo effect. There absolutely is a halo effect when you're at a film festival like that with the top-notch people presenting and then doing a Q&A after, and the audience is there wanting to love it. And there have been some of those. It was a kind of a heady experience, and then I go back and watch it afterwards, and it's like,
Well, we're short on time. Anyone have any final thoughts? No? Cool. Well, if you'd like to
go see movies on the big screen.
You see,
Talking about the different. I mean, I think that's part of why Mission Impossible overwhelmed us.
Yes.
Is on the seeing it in IMAX was just absolutely thrilling, and on the even though I know the difference, I'm watching things on my computer regularly, and I got a separate TV next to it, and it just isn't the same experience. And then you have to factor that in. It's like, I know I'm not getting the full cinematic experience here.
And go do it now, because there are a handful of great films playing at the multiplex right now. It's incredible the little pop of quality that we've gotten lately. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you to the panelists and giving us some great insight. And there are some